Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Onboard story. I'm going to address a question I get a lot in the comments, and that is which car, or rather, what's the difference between a Ferrari 458 GT3 and a 488 GT3? And I often tell people that the only thing that is the same is the badge on the front of the car, because everything else is different. Not only are the chassis and engines different, the interiors are completely different, steering wheels, handling, engines, you name it. But they are both Ferraris. So we're first going to take a look at the 458 GT3, which is what I'm driving now. I managed to have onboard videos of the car at the same track. I've raced at the Nürburgring in the 458 and the 488, so I figured that this would be a great chance and opportunity to do a comparison. So the first thing that you'll notice with the 458 is the sound. This thing's got a naturally aspirated V8 engine, and it's a screamer. I can't remember exactly the revs that we used to change gear at, but it was very high, and the longer you let the thing rev, the more it pulled. So definitely very satisfying car to drive. Also, compared to the 488, which we will cover in a second, it's a lot more aggressive. The brake pedal is a lot stiffer. You have to really jump on the pedal quite aggressively to get the maximum performance out of the car. And overall the chassis feels tighter, but not in like a good or bad way. It feels like there's less travel in the dampers. It does feel, once you've driven the 488, it feels a little bit older. So the general interior of the car, and also the control weights, which is when we talk about control weights, we talk about the feeling of the throttle pedal, the feeling of the brake pedal, the feeling of the steering, like the steering rack. It feels like a generation before. So we're going to start here a new lap in the 458, braking for turn 1. You jump on the pedal as hard as you can, very little steering input required. There's a lot of feedback through the steering wheel. It feels more like, similar in some ways to a kart when you drive it. Very responsive, but not quite what you experience in Gran Turismo Sport, which it's responsive, but it's also snappy. This car doesn't necessarily snap. It was a very successful gentleman driver's car, and also a pro driver's car. So they had a really good balance between an aggressive setup and underlying feeling with drivability. So you see my hands move a lot more in this car than you would in, say, a 488, but at the same time, that's just me trying to extract the most out of the car, and at no point when I'm driving this car do I feel like it's suddenly going to snap out of control, out of nowhere, which is kind of what we experience in some of the simulators. So we don't have to run extreme brake bias here or anything like that. It just means with this car in particular, if you attack it more so than you would one of the modern GT3s, it just gave you more lap time. You'll see that when I ride the curbs, you'll see there's more of a reaction from the car and the onboard. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, that it felt always like the suspension in this car was stiffer compared to the modern car. The gearbox is also very different. It's not as refined as the modern car, and when you change gear in a 458, it's quite aggressive. It gives you a nice little kick in the back, and just overall such a visceral experience. I had the privilege of driving a DTM car in 2016 for a day, which I have posted on my YouTube channel a very long time ago. And I was worried on that day that after I'd driven the DTM car, the Mercedes V8 naturally aspirated DTM car, that when I got back in the Ferrari, it would feel a little bit more dull because it's a GT3, but that is not the case. Every time I drive a 458 GT3, I have a massive smile on my face because they are so fun to drive and so rewarding when you really put a lot of energy into them. This specific clip came from a race stint in the Blancpain Sprint Series, and overall it was pretty good. I think at the time we won our class, but I was quite far behind. This was the second stint of the day, and I was I could see the leaders, and they weren't necessarily getting away, so I was pretty stoked with that. I was still very much an amateur at this time, but again, this car was just so fun to drive that I didn't want this stint to end. Braking down here for I forget what the name of this hairpin is, but you brake just after the concrete, and it's a double apex. which I have explained in a track guide for Gran Turismo Sport. Very much I learned how to drive this track again using simulators, using GT Sport. GT Sport specifically, in my opinion, got the track accuracy pretty good. The curbing and the reference points are very similar. So yeah, what else can I tell you about this car? You'll see the difference between the steering rack in this car compared to the modern car. It's got a completely different dashboard. The seat position in the 458 was actually a lot tighter than the 488. So to look at when you're inside the car, it felt like you're a bit more cramped. I could never really get a good seat position in this car. But overall, it was still quite a quick car. I mean, I can't really tell you lap times because the 458 in 2017, when I drove this, had a reasonably good BOP, so it was still competitive. But if you put one on track today versus a 488, I think the 488 would pretty much smoke it. And anyway, the 48 over a stint length is much better. But anyway, I just want you to listen to the car for this lap, and then we'll cut to the more modern machinery. So just enjoy this lap, enjoy the sound of the 458 GT3. Okay, as we come to finish this lap, as you can see, again, this car requires a lot of energy and inputs to drive fast, but still seems pretty awesome to drive. Okay, now we switch over to the modern and magical 488. This is from 2018. I'm behind a Lexus here. I think it's actually Christian Klein, who's a Formula 1 driver. So, first thing to notice is the sound. I'll keep quiet for that later. And also just look at the amount of steering input I have to put into the car. Now, the main thing with the 488 GT3, it's not like I have a lot of understeer because you see these big steering inputs. It's that the steering ratio of the car has been, I think it's increased. I think that's the right term. The steering ratio is bigger because they wanted to be a little bit less responsive for the gentleman drivers. So the net result is you have to steer more for the same amount of cornering output. So the input was greater to the output compared to the 458. Also in this car you brake a lot later. There's a lot more aero in this car compared to the 458. You use sort of more aero-esque lines, whereas in the 458 you did a more V-shaped line. And you could carry more speed through high-speed corners like this one, even when you're following other cars, because the 488 has a massive front splitter, much better rear wing design, and also the rear diffuser is a huge update of the 458. So there's a lot more stability in the high-speed corners. This car excels at places like Spa, whereas the 458 had a really good, strong engine, but not such good like high-speed stability. You could still carry a lot of speed in the 458, but the 488 just gives you more confidence in the high speeds when you're going through fast corners. The brake pedal in the 488 is much softer. There goes the Lexus, it's going to go box, and this gives us, I think, 1 or 2 free laps on our own to commentate on the awesomeness of this car. I really enjoy racing the 488. I think it's such a brilliant race car, and every time I see in my calendar that I get to race one, which has been very frequent this year. I don't tire of it. I really do look forward to it. Again, braking much later. Look at the big steering input for the hairpin compared to the 458. If some of you want to jump back and forth, you can in the video just to get a comparison. And just overall a little bit less input compared to the 458. We roll the car into corners much smoother than we do. We can use the curbs a little bit more aggressively in the 488 because of the suspension and damping is quite a bit different. So that gives us a bit more compliance and a little bit less aggression or snappiness when we're on the curbs. Now, I'm not talking about the snappiness that you experience in simulators. It's just more, there's less of a kick through the steering wheel, and it's a bit more easier to manage with the 458. I mean, sorry, with the 488. The 488 is easier to manage on curbs. Another thing is we have a much more advanced traction control system. Obviously, that particular moment out the hairpin was not as good as I would explain, but in the 458 we only have one stage of traction, which is basically how much, from 0 to 10. However, in the 488 we have two stages. We have when it kicks in and how much it kicks in by, and both of those can be adjusted from 0 to 12. We generally keep them at the same setting throughout the race, so we usually run, say for example in qualifying 2 and 2 or 3 3, and then in the race we go to 5 and 5. It's only in unique situations, circumstances where we'd offset, so we'd turn down the when, so it comes in later, but when it comes in we'd adjust the how much to a higher value. This just takes time and experience. The gearbox in this car is also much smoother, and it's also a bit longer, so in the 458 we kind of always ran a gear higher than the 488, because in the 488 we consider first gear an actual gear. It's not a pull away gear like it is in the 458, and we use it quite a lot. So for example, the hairpin there, we'd use first gear and really hang out the gear much longer, whereas in the 458 you could maybe get away with second gear. That changes a lot of like the thinking and the style that you have for these tighter tracks, and jumping between the two, which I had to do quite a lot in 2017, was actually not so easy because they were so different in feeling. I couldn't just immediately jump out of one car and into the next and immediately be fast. It took 1 or 2 laps to readjust to the different steering control weights. Like the brake pedal was softer in the 488, had a completely different style of braking. You had to brake more like a simulator driver, so softer inputs, and also the throttle is a little bit longer. So all these things make small little differences that require some adaptation when you're swapping between the two cars. A lot of people ask me which one I prefer, and it's not that simple. If I was only to do track days, I would probably choose the 458 for private track days, but if I'm going to be racing and trying to win championships, then the 488 is absolutely the way to go. So just to end here, we're heading towards the pits for a driver change in this race. I'll keep quiet until the credits. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you to all my Patreon subscribers and members, and I'll catch you around the next lap.